Pragmatism is a philosophical tradition that began in the United States around 1870. Pragmatism rejects the idea that the function of thought is to describe, represent, or mirror reality. Instead, pragmatists consider thought an instrument or tool for prediction, problem-solving and action. Pragmatists contend that most philosophical topics, such as the nature of knowledge, language, concepts, meaning, belief, and science, are all best viewed in terms of their practical uses and successes. A few of the various but interrelated positions often characteristic of philosophers working from a pragmatist approach include epistemology, a coherentist theory of justification that rejects the claim that all knowledge and justified belief rest ultimately on a foundation of non-inferential knowledge or justified belief. Coherentists hold that justification is solely a function of some relationship between beliefs, none of which are privileged beliefs in the way maintained by foundationalist theories of justification. Epistemology, a deflationary or pragmatist theory of truth. The former is the epistemological claim that assertions that predicate truth of a statement do not attribute a property called truth to such a statement, while the latter is the epistemological claim that assertions that predicate truth of a statement attribute the property of useful to believe to such a statement. Metaphysics, a pluralist view that there is more than one sound way to conceptualize the world and its content. Philosophy of science, an instrumentalist and scientific anti-realist view that a scientific concept or theory should be evaluated by how effectively it explains and predicts phenomena, as opposed to how accurately it describes objective reality. Philosophy of language, an anti-representationalist view that rejects analyzing the semantic meaning of propositions, mental states, and statements in terms of a correspondence or representational relationship and instead analyzes semantic meaning in terms of notions like dispositions to action, inferential relationships, and/or functional roles. Not to be confused with pragmatics, a subfield of linguistics with no relation to philosophical pragmatism. Additionally, forms of empiricism, fallibilism, verificationism, and Aquinian naturalist metaphilosophy are all commonly elements of pragmatist philosophies. Many pragmatists are epistemological relativists and see this to be an important facet of their pragmatism. But this is controversial, and other pragmatists argue such relativism to be seriously misguided. Charles Sanders Peirce deserves much of the credit for pragmatism, along with later 20th-century contributors William James and John Dewey. Pragmatism enjoyed renewed attention after W.V.O. Quine and Wilfrid Sellars used a revised pragmatism to criticize logical positivism in the 1960s. Inspired by the work of Quine and Sellars, a brand of pragmatism known sometimes as neo-pragmatism gained influence through Richard Rorty, the most influential of the late 20th century pragmatists, along with Hilary Putnam and Robert Brandim. Contemporary pragmatism may be broadly divided into a strict analytic tradition and a neoclassical pragmatism that adheres to the work of Peirce, James, and Dewey. The word pragmatism derives from Greek pyro gamma mu alpha, a thing, a fact, which comes from pyro alpha sigma sigma omega, to pass over, to practice, to achieve. The word pragmatism, as a piece of technical terminology in philosophy, refers to a specific set of associated philosophical views originating in the late 20th century. However, the phrase is often confused with pragmatism in the context of politics and with a non-technical use of pragmatism in ordinary contexts, referring to dealing with matters in one's life realistically and in a way that is based on practical rather than abstract considerations. Origins. Pragmatism as a philosophical movement began in the United States in the 1870s. Its direction was determined by the Metaphysical Club members Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and Chauncey Wright, as well as John Dewey and George Herbert Mead. The first use in print of the name pragmatism was in 1898 by James, who credited Peirce with coining the term during the early 1870s. James regarded Peirce's 1877-8 Illustrations of the Logic of Science series as the foundation of pragmatism. Peirce in turn wrote in 1906 that Nicholas Street, John Green had been instrumental by emphasizing the importance of applying Alexander Bain's definition of belief, which was that upon which a man is prepared to act. Peirce wrote that, from this definition, pragmatism is scarce more than a corollary, so that I am disposed to think of him as the grandfather of pragmatism. John Shook has said. Chauncey Wright also deserves considerable credit, for as both Peirce and James recall, it was Wright who demanded a phenomenalist and fallibilist empiricism as an alternative to rationalistic speculation. Inspiration for the various pragmatists included Francis Bacon, who coined the saying "Ips acient potestas est", David Hume for his naturalistic account of knowledge and action, Thomas Reid for his direct realism, Immanuel Kant for his idealism, and from whom Peirce derives the name pragmatism, G.W. F. Hegel, who introduced temporality into philosophy, J.S. Mill for his nominalism and empiricism, George Berkeley for his project to eliminate all unclear concepts from philosophy, Henry Bergson, who influenced William James to renounce intellectualism and logical methods. Summary: Peirce developed the idea that inquiry depends on real doubt, not mere verbal or hyperbolic doubt, and said, in order to understand a conception in a fruitful way, consider the practical effects of the objects of your conception. Then, your conception of those effects is the whole of your conception of the object, which he later called the pragmatic maxim. It equates any conception of an object to a conception of that object's effects to a general extent of the effect's conceivable implications for informed practice. It is the heart of his pragmatism as a method of experimentational mental reflection, arriving at conceptions in terms of conceivable confirmatory and disconfirmatory circumstances, a method hospitable to the generation of explanatory hypotheses, and conducive to the employment and improvement of verification. Typical of Peirce is his concern with inference to explanatory hypotheses as outside the usual foundational alternative between deductivist rationalism and inductivist empiricism. Although he was a mathematical logician and a founder of statistics, Peirce lectured and further wrote on pragmatism to make clear his own interpretation. While framing a conception's meaning in terms of conceivable tests, Peirce emphasized that, since a conception is general, its meaning, its intellectual purport, equates to its acceptance's implications for general practice, rather than to any definite set of real consequences. A conception's clarified meaning points toward its conceivable verifications, but the outcomes are not meanings, but individual upshots. Peirce in 1905 coined the new name Pragmatism, for the precise purpose of expressing the original definition, saying that all went happily with James's and Schiller's variant uses of the old name Pragmatism, and that he nonetheless coined the new name, because of the old name's growing use in literary journals, where it gets abused. Yet in a 1906 manuscript he cited as causes his differences with James and Schiller, and, in a 1908 publication, his differences with James as well as literary author Giovanni Papini. Peirce in any case regarded his views that truth is immutable and infinity is real, as being opposed by the other pragmatists, but he remained allied with them on other issues. Central pragmatist facets. Anti-reification of concepts and theories. Dewey, in The Quest for Certainty, criticized what he called the philosophical fallacy. Philosophers often take categories for granted because they don't realize that these are merely nominal concepts that were invented to help solve specific problems. This causes metaphysical and conceptual confusion. Various examples are the ultimate being of Hegelian philosophers, the belief in a realm of value, the idea that logic, because it is an abstraction from concrete thought, has nothing to do with the act of concrete thinking, and so on. David L. Hildebrand sums up the problem perceptual inattention to the specific functions comprising inquiry led realists and idealists alike to formulate accounts of knowledge that project the products of extensive abstraction back onto experience. Naturalism and anti-Cartesianism. From the outset, pragmatists wanted to reform philosophy and bring it more in line with the scientific method as they understood it. They argued that idealist and realist philosophy had a tendency to present human knowledge as something beyond what science could grasp. These philosophies then resorted either to a phenomenology inspired by Kant or to correspondence theories of knowledge and truth. Pragmatists criticize the former for its a priorism, and the latter because it takes correspondence as an unanalyzable fact. Pragmatism instead tries to explain, psychologically and biologically, how the relation between knower and known works in the world. In 1868, C.S. Peirce argued that there is no power of intuition in the sense of a cognition unconditioned by inference, and no power of introspection, intuitive or otherwise, and that awareness of an internal world is by hypothetical inference from external facts. Introspection and intuition were staple philosophical tools at least since Descartes. He argued that there is no absolutely first cognition in a cognitive process. Such a process has its beginning but can always be analyzed into finer, cognitive stages. That which we call introspection does not give privileged access to knowledge about the mind. The self is a concept that is derived from our interaction with the external world and not the other way around. At the same time, he held persistently that pragmatism and epistemology in general could not be derived from principles of psychology understood as a special science. What we do think is too different from what we should think. In his Illustrations of the Logic of Science series, Peirce formulated both pragmatism and principles of statistics as aspects of scientific method in general. This is an important point of disagreement with most other pragmatists, who advocate a more thorough naturalism and psychologism. Richard Rorty expanded on these and other arguments in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, in which he criticized attempts by many philosophers of science to carve out a space for epistemology that is entirely unrelated to, and sometimes thought of as superior to, the empirical sciences. W.V. Quine, instrumental in bringing naturalized epistemology back into favor with his essay Epistemology Naturalized, also criticized traditional epistemology and its Cartesian dream of absolute certainty. The dream, he argued, was impossible in practice as well as misguided in theory, because it separates epistemology from scientific inquiry. Reconciliation of anti-skepticism and fallibilism. Hilary Putnam has suggested that the reconciliation of anti-skepticism and fallibilism is the central goal of American pragmatism. Although all human knowledge is partial, with no ability to take a God's eye view, this does not necessitate a globalized skeptical attitude, a radical philosophical skepticism. Peirce insisted that in reasoning, there is the presupposition, and at least the hope, that truth and the real are discoverable and would be discovered, sooner or later, but still inevitably, by investigation taken far enough. And contrary to Descartes' famous and influential methodology in the Meditations on First Philosophy, doubt cannot be feigned or created by verbal fiat to motivate fruitful inquiry, and much less can philosophy begin in universal doubt. Doubt, like belief, requires justification. Genuine doubt irritates and inhibits, in the sense that belief is that upon which one is prepared to act. It arises from confrontation with some specific recalcitrant matter of fact, which unsettles our belief in some specific proposition. Inquiry is then the rationally self-controlled process of attempting to return to a settled state of belief about the matter. Note that anti-skepticism is a reaction to modern academic skepticism in the wake of Descartes. The pragmatist insistence that all knowledge is tentative is quite congenial to the older skeptical tradition. Pragmatist theory of truth and epistemology. Pragmatism was not the first to apply evolution to theories of knowledge. Schopenhauer advocated a biological idealism, as what's useful to an organism to believe might differ wildly from what is true. Here knowledge and action are portrayed as two separate spheres with an absolute or transcendental truth above and beyond any sort of inquiry. Organisms used to cope with life. Pragmatism challenges this idealism by providing an ecological account of knowledge. Inquiry is how organisms can get a grip on their environment. Real and true are functional labels in inquiry and cannot be understood outside of this context. It is not realist in a traditionally robust sense of realism, but it is realist in how it acknowledges an external world which must be dealt with. Many of James' best-turned phrases, truth's cash value and the true is only the expedient in our way of thinking, were taken out of context and caricatured in contemporary literature as representing the view where any idea with practical utility is true. William James wrote, "It is high time to urge the use of a little imagination in philosophy. The unwillingness of some of our critics to read any but the silliest of possible meanings into our statements is as discreditable to their imaginations as anything I know in recent philosophic history." Schiller says the truth is that which works. Thereupon he is treated as one who limits verification to the lowest material utilities. Dewey says truth is what gives satisfaction. He is treated as one who believes in calling everything true which, if it were true, would be pleasant. In reality, James asserts, the theory is a great deal more subtle. The role of belief in representing reality is widely debated in pragmatism. Is a belief valid when it represents reality? Copying is one genuine mode of knowing. A belief's dispositions which qualify as true or false depending on how helpful they prove in inquiry and in action. Is it only in the struggle of intelligent organisms with the surrounding environment that beliefs acquire meaning? Does a belief only become true when it succeeds in this struggle? In pragmatism, nothing practical or useful is held to be necessarily true, nor is anything which helps to survive merely in the short term. For example, to believe my cheating spouse is faithful may help me feel better now, but it is certainly not useful from a more long-term perspective because it doesn't accord with the fact